Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Miller. I'm the Executive Director here at Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs, and I am honored to be asked to present to all of you at your conference. So I have limited time, so I'm going to dive right in. So Jeff, would you pull up the first slide? Thank you. All right, so this is the problem that we're intervening in, coercive control, and it's a complex one, and it takes, all these different agencies and community-based agencies working together to really have an impact on the depth and the length of time that this problem has been existing in our communities, right? So early on in the movement here in the United States, we identified coercive control as a factor, as something that they were using economic abuse, emotional abuse, using children in a way to coerce her into submission, to dominate her as an intimate partner. Next slide, Jeff. Later, Evan Stark wrote a book called Coercive Control, and in that book, he basically says what we know, that the majority of the violence that women experience is not physical. The physical violence that he commits sets up his ability to coerce her into submission. So coercion is the daily kind of form of abuse that she has to endure. All right, so the power and control wheel that was developed here in Duluth in 1984 really highlights the tactics that he uses. Intimidation, coercion, threat, all of those different tactics. Those are the major tactics. There are other tactics that aren't on there, but these are the major ones that women identified that he uses against her to dominate her, right? And it's all held together by this threat of or the use of physical or sexual violence. Because when that's on the outside of the wheel, those tactics take on a different meaning inside that relationship. So for example, emotional abuse. People commit emotional abuse all the time in their own relationships, but when there's the threat of the use of physical violence as a consequence for not doing what somebody else wants you to do in that relationship, now the person who's being abused has to take that emotional abuse in a different way, right? Do they resist it? Do they accept it? Do they try to get out of the relationship? Because those are really the only choices that a survivor living with somebody using coercive control has. Leave, fight, or just submit to what he's doing to her, right? And victims do a lot of submitting in these relationships because they're trying to avoid the consequence, which then from us, our point of view on the outside, when we see that, we misinterpret it, right? We see as her accepting the abuse. We see her as being dysfunctional, right? As opposed to navigating a threat, which is really what's going on. Next slide, Jeff. Okay, so if we want to think about how does coercive control get established, there's these different steps that the men mostly go through to establish it. The first one is he becomes a threat to her physical, emotional, or spiritual well-being. He has demonstrated that he's willing to cross a line, to hurt her, again, emotionally, spiritually, or physically, right? Identify and use her needs and attachments as levers. So he's paying attention to what she values. She values her children. She values her career. She values her family. She values her friends, right? So any kind of attachments that she has, he begins to first identify and then restrict, deplete, or destroy access to those things in lieu of compliance to what he wants. So you don't get to see your children unless you do what I say. And when we interviewed victims here in Duluth who were using our supervised visitation center, one of the things that was fairly shocking to us is to how much sexual violence was being committed in parking lots where unsupervised exchanges were taking place. He's had the kids for 2 months. He gets out of his car, leaves the kids in there, gets into her car and says that, and demands sex right there on the spot, or he drives away with the children, right? And she's went to the courts, and the courts have said, well, that if he's not complying with the court order, call the police. So she calls the police, and the police come out and they say, well, this is a civil matter. Go back to court. So essentially, the community has said, we are not a resource to you. You're on your own, right? And so then what the victims ended up saying is that we end up doing things in that car that we would never choose to do, but he has our kids. And here he has my kids, and I have no way of getting my kids back without doing what he says, right? That's not what we want to create in our communities, where women are on their own to find ways of in this sense, using their body to be able to see their children. And then intermittent episodes of overt violence to remind her that this is what's going to happen if you don't do what I'm demanding, or if you don't stop doing what I'm demanding. Essentially, those are the two things, right? All right, next slide, Jeff. Okay, so what are survivors' experience within civil or criminal systems? And again, these are general and these are boiled down. There's a lot more detail that we could go into, but victims feel like they are the ones responsible for his violence. They're sitting in front of a family court judge, and the judge is treating this as if she's doing things to him that are irritating him, and then there's this violence that happens, and they need to get along better, right? Well, she wants nothing more than to get along better, but she doesn't have any control over that, because that's not the nature of the problem. The problem is that he's abusive and he's dominating her as an individual, and he's consequencing her for not complying. That's the problem, and you can't get along with that, right? So the way the court looks at it, the way the court treats it, tells her that they don't know what the problem actually is. Therefore, they're not a resource. Asked to give information, or the case is dismissed. In other words, in the criminal end of things, everything hinges on the survivor, right? They put all the weight on her, and if you don't give us all the information that we need, the many times that we're asking for it, then we're just going to dismiss the case, right? So in other words, they're not creatively thinking about how to build a case so that the victim's statements aren't the only thing, aren't the only evidence that this case hinges upon, right? The criminal response is focused entirely on accountability. That's how most justice systems are organized. They're organized to impose accountability. But there's a way to organize those responses so that safety is equally as important, if not more important, than his accountability, right? And there's all kinds of mechanisms that you can build in to make sure that but the way that you're going about building the case, adjudicating the case, or supervising this individual post conviction isn't making it less safe for her. And then the system makes demands that don't align with the nature of the problem or safety needs. And again, whether it's family court or criminal court, judges in criminal court saying, well, ma'am, there's no broken bones, the x-rays don't demonstrate any damage to your throat. What do you want to do? Right? Putting it on her in open court in front of him. And what does she say? I want my family back. Well, what else is she going to say? Right? You've just demonstrated you don't understand the problem. You've put me on the spot. I have nothing more I can say here other than what he wants me to say. Right? And if I say anything different, then I'm subject to being consequenced outside of this courtroom. And that's, again, another example of submission. Submit, flee, fight. She submits because she's trying to avoid the consequence. And then the court thinks it's done its job. But they've actually missed the problem, and she knows it. Therefore, that system is not a resource to her. All right. So what things can systems do to make a survivor feel like they are a resource? The response indicates that he's solely responsible for the violence. There's no conversation in family court, in criminal court, that is allowed, that gives the excuse that she's the problem, right? Nobody, no matter how nasty somebody could be, they don't deserve being repeatedly beaten into submission by their intimate partner. Nothing you can do deserves that. That is the problem of the person who's committing the violence. The investigation builds cases that don't rely entirely on her statements. So there's photographs. There are witness contacts. When you've got a recanting victim, which you will absolutely have in these cases, that's just normal course, right? Then you bring in expert witnesses to talk about recantation, right, to the juries so that they understand why victims would say one thing to police at the scene and another thing in a courtroom when they're testifying, right? Although accountability is the focus, victim safety is equally important. We talked about that. And the system agrees to a shared set of understandings that really are developed from the nature of the problem. So the next slide, we'll talk about those. There are 3 types of domestic violence. There's coercive control. There's resistive violence that comes out of that from the survivor. And then there's everything else that falls under the law, right? So we are focused on coercive control, or we're trying to figure out, is the violence that she's committing coercive or resistive, right? And we have the mechanisms in place to do that. The power of the state should be restricted to controlling the illegal activity of the offender. The state shouldn't be dictating to her what she should do because he's beating her up. Because then the state takes on the same kind of role in her life that he does. That tells her what she can and can't do, tells her what where she can go, who she can associate with, all of that, right? So if that happens, again, the state is no longer a resource to her. Understanding that victims are rarely free to cooperate with the system to hold him accountable. Okay? If all of us understood that, then what mechanisms would we create to overcome that very common characteristic of these cases? Now, one thing is we just wash our hands and walk away and say, well, we can't do anything. But there are jurisdictions all over the United States, including here in Minnesota, which are successfully prosecuting cases where victims are recanting their testimony and saying, what I told the police was a lie. What you see in those photographs didn't happen that way. And they're still getting successful prosecutions because of all the different ways they're overcoming this problem. And then it relieves her of being blamed for the abuse, right? Or blamed for the fact that the case didn't go forward. Account for power differences between victim and offender. Every single one of our interventions that we create, laws, policies, protocols, should account for the power he has over her. As one victim said in a focus group, when you lose sight of the power he has over me, then you lose sight of me. Because I never have a moment where I can operate and not account for what he can do to me, right? What his potential to abuse me in the future because of what I'm doing in the present, right? And then offenders are responsible for stopping their violence, period, right? That's the only responsibility, that we place on someone in this space is him to stop being abusive, right? So if we can build a community response with these understandings, then they were likely to move a long way towards creating a resource for survivors and ultimately for offenders, as we'll talk about in a minute. All right, next slide, Jeff. All right, so one of the questions I get asked a lot is, does specialization in this domestic violence problem, is it effective? And to my knowledge, there's no research, whether it's probation, the courts, or law enforcement, that shows that specialization is not effective, right? So basically, when you've got a judge, for example, who is repeatedly seeing these cases, they begin to learn the complexities of the problem and how to navigate them. Same with law enforcement, same with probation. So what we've seen here in Duluth is when we've got prosecutors who specialize in domestic violence cases, they become really good at them. when we got probation officers who are specialized in domestic violence cases, they become not only really good at dealing with him and managing his threat, but they become really good at making connections to survivors and helping her build a life safer, independent of him if that's what she wants, or safer with him if that's what she chooses to do. And then law enforcement. One of the things law enforcement's good at is investigating crime and speaking to offenders. One of the things that they can be challenged with is speaking with survivors, right? So when we've got investigators, as we do here, who only do domestic violence cases, they become, again, really good at speaking with survivors and building trust relationships with them. And the more trust she has with the system, the more evidence that you get. What's law enforcement's goal? To get evidence. If you want evidence, then you've got to build rapport. You've got to build a bridge, right? Because she knows that everything she says could come back to hurt her, right? So she needs to really trust who she's talking to and what they're going to do with it. All right, next slide, Jeff. So this is the post-separation wheel. The tactics are listed to the left here. This wheel was developed with women who were using our Duluth Family Visitation Center. And what we wanted to know are what are the tactics that he's using that are coercive after she's left. So now they're not living together. She's left him. She has kids, right? But he continues to try and abuse. What are all the ways that he tries to do that? And one of the things that the survivors said that was crucial to understanding the tactics post-separation was how he used the system and how efficient he was at getting the system to be the arm of his abuse, right? So when you look at this wheel, you see it's built on a foundation of systems and institutions, because he can't directly abuse her anymore because he doesn't have access to her, but the systems do. So when he calls up child protection and says that she's living with a drug abuser or that she's getting high every night, then they're investigating that. Or he's hauling her back to court time and time and time again, knowing that she can't keep up with his ability to pay for all that court time. And so she's more likely to relent or to come back to him, right? Or winning custody of the kids for the sole purpose of getting her to come back to live with him, because the only way she's going to see her kids is if she lives with him, right? This is how the courts, this is how our systems, government systems, get used by offenders. They're relentless. I mean, as you see, one of the bands around the outside of this is his unrelenting pursuit of her, right? Like he just won't stop it. Typically, until he finds somebody else to basically do the same thing to. But as long as she's got his children, he's going to be unrelenting in his abuse. And it really probably won't stop unless he's rehabilitated until those kids are 18 and moved on. I mean, this is what she has to endure. So we don't want to set ourselves up as community-based or government-based systems to collude with that. We want to be able to identify it and respond to it in a way for what it is, right? And again, there's all kinds of strategies around that we don't have the time to get into, but that's the goal, right? Not to be the arm of his abuse towards her and the children. All right, next slide, Jeff. So why build a coordinated community response? Why put the effort into it anyway? Because it is a lot of work, right? But here's the thing that I always say when people say, well, you know, all of what you're talking about here and building these policies and making them interlock with each of the different government agencies and then building protocols to show them how to do all these, execute all these policies, and then do the focus groups and get how women are experiencing the violence in these communities and all that, and pulling all this together into a coordinated response. That's a lot of work. Well, let me tell you, you are spending a lot of time on these cases. right? So the less of a consequence that a community has for a man doing this to his partner, the more it's going to happen. And there's no incentive for him to stop, right? He'll continue to do what he's doing as long as there isn't a meaningful consequence that is being imposed upon him, right? So you, as a community, will spend a great deal of resource on this regardless. How do you want to spend it, right? And so the last one down there, when it's coordinated and a police officer who responds to a house can see that the work that they've done was being used by the prosecutor in a way that held him accountable, right? And then he's on supervision, and now he's in rehab, and there's opportunities for that individual to change. It gives people the sense that the extra time that they're investing isn't being wasted, right? So I was in California, and there was a community, and the officers spent at tops 10 minutes on a case at the scene. And when asked why so little time, they said, well, that's all the time we've got. We got to get to the next case, right? Well, what we did is we took those reports that they produced in that 10-minute span, and they were dismal, to be perfectly honest. There was just not enough in there for a prosecutor to use. So what happened is that 8 out of 10 of these cases ended up getting dismissed just immediately, right? So then what we did, and this is a fairly large community, we took all the domestic assault calls, right? And we gave it 10 to 15 minutes time frame on each one of them, and then showed how many months a year officers are completely wasting their time responding to a domestic assault because these cases were never going to go anywhere, right? So again, if you're going to spend time, how do you want to spend it? And do you want to spend it in a way that has results that not only make it easier for practitioners within government agencies, for example, to do their job, but to make the community a safer place? I know this is short. I know it wasn't a lot of time, but it was just kind of an introductory idea into this notion of coordinating your responses and what some of the downfall is if you don't, and what some of the upside is if you do. So good luck to all of you. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for showing up at this conference that you're at. And it would be great to speak to all of you in the future. So thank you, and good day.